It's time for the Bible. We don't really know for sure what is and what is not. Holy Ghost, God, God, blasphemy, spun, Ghost. That's right. It's time for the Bible. Interpretation, star, Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Time for another Bible Geek. Luckily, not for another Bible Geek in the sense of the host, but at any rate, I'm the current one, Robert M. Price, and I'd like to deal with some of those questions that torment all biblically curious minds, and the answers of which will probably send us to hell. But anyhow, this one is very detailed one from a guy that has his own theories and is very innovative and speculative, Jason Quackenbush. Welcome him. He says, the deeper I get into thinking about the first century Christian movement, the more difficult it is for me to get a handle on exactly who this character Simon or Cephas or Peter is and what role he is supposed to play. I have come up with a number of possibilities, but none of them seem like anything more than speculation, and I'd like your input on where I can do some further reading here. First, there's the traditional Catholic view that Peter was the first among the apostles and the founder of the Catholic Church in Jewish communities throughout Rome. I find I'm skeptical of this view, largely because it is the received view, but I don't know that I have specific reasons to doubt that this was the case. Well, there are some reasons to doubt that. There's nothing in the Epistle to the Romans or the book of Acts, you don't even have to take those as historically accurate sources. And in fact, if they're not, it makes the point even stronger that they don't seem to know anything about this. It appears that Romans anticipates there being Jewish Christian communities there, but we hear nothing about Peter. We do in First Corinthians, right? But plus there's the overshadowing all these questions is the interest of early churches to gain clout by claiming foundation by this or that apostle. Can you top this? And so that could, Peter would be an obvious choice there, given the role he plays in the Gospels. Okay, two, there's the lowercase Catholic view where Peter was the charismatic leader of the apostles who mediated the conflict between James the Just and Paul or Simon Magus and served as a sort of middle ground and founder of the movement among, quote, Judaizing, unquote, Gentiles that eventually led to the Catholic Church. Here, his rise to prominence is a result of the raising of Jerusalem, that is R-A-Z-I-N-G, right? And the increased importance of the Jewish diaspora to whom Peter had been the original missionary. I know at least one writer has seen Peter as being in conflict with the Jewish Christian church, according to Matthew, and I would think this might be the support of this view of Peter. Yeah, this strikes me as a kind of a rationalizing, almost euhemeristic version of the first one. Well, it's not quite what the official Catholic line says, but maybe it was pretty much that way. A little messier, maybe, a little more modest. But I think the role of Peter as the mediator comes from mainly Acts 15, where the various parties are debating whether Gentile converts have to be circumcised and keep the Torah. And there's some hardliners that say, well, you bet they have to. And then there's Paul saying, no, why bother? But then Peter gets up and says pretty much what Paul does in Galatians 2. And it seems like one of the prime cases of Catholicizing, an attempt to whitewash divisions in the early church. And as Bauer pointed out, and to use Peter as a mouthpiece by making him sound like Paul, which is also the standpoint taken in both the First and Second Peter, and because in Galatians, you have him as a mediating figure, but just in terms of one notch on the ruler. He's not said to have reconciled anybody or anything. It's just that he seems to waver back and forth between two opinions, that he wasn't as strictly Jewish as the kosher, etc., as James from Jerusalem was. He was willing to eat with Gentiles and all that before James's agents appeared, but then decided to pretend to go along with them so he didn't get in trouble. Well, presumably that just meant, at least the way it's depicted in Galatians, that he was really more in the Pauline camp, but was a hypocrite. And that doesn't exactly make him a mediator. On this whole thing, I would suggest you read my article, called Antioch's Aftershocks. And it, oh boy, where did this appear? It was in something about studies in ancient Judaism and Christianity, I forget, edited by Alan J. Avery Peck and Jacob Neusner. And you could probably find it online. I can't quite think of the exact title of the anthology. But even here, I wonder if you can posit that much historical accuracy for what's going on in Galatians, because as you know, the Pauline autobiography stuff where he goes to Jerusalem to meet with the pillars and gets their perhaps grudging authentication and endorsement may really be based on Marcion going to Rome. And so that's a big decision, which approach you're going to take on that. But I think you are getting to that in option number 3, and here it is. There's the radical view in which Simon, Cephas, and Peter potentially represent 2 to 4 different characters, variously combined and multiplied in different texts. Cephas, the apostle who is associated with the pillars by Paul. Peter, a mythical version of Cephas, who was historicized into the Gospels by the followers of the 12, seeking to reconcile with Rome after the razing of the temple. Simeon of Jerusalem, the possibly historical bishop of Jerusalem who took over from James the Just. The Simon who appeared as a member of the family of James and therefore the family of Jesus in an earlier period of historicization. All of whom may have led through Robert Eisenman style multiplication into the characters of Simon of Cyrene, Simon the Zealots, Simon Niger, Simon the Pharisee, etc., and Simon Magus, the Samaritan Gnostic who would become Catholicized as Paul. That's pretty much my view, as I gather, 4. Then there's the lesser radical view in which Peter is 2 characters. First, the Cephas of Paul's letters, who is either an apostle or a pillar or both. The second character is purely legendary and incorporated into the gospel tradition later by people trying to reconcile the Cephas of Paul's letters with the apostle lists of the gospel oral tradition, and thus through various multiplications became a figure lost in legend. On this view, this is the rock on which I will build my church, quote, is an attempt to reconcile the 2 legendary figures of Cephas and Simon, who had originally been 2 different characters and possibly savior figures in their own right, into a single subordinate to the Catholic Christ Jesus emerging as a consensus in the 2nd century. Yeah, I also deal with that. I'm sure you know. In my interpretation of the thing in the beginning of 1 Corinthians, some of you say, I am of Paul, I am of Cephas, I am of Apollo, I am of Christ. Then finally, the more I think about it, the more the possibilities seem to multiply, but these seem to be the ones that are best supported by the evidence I'm aware of. I would very much like your opinion on the matter, as well as any suggestions for further reading. Well, I would just add one thing there. As you know, I kind of embrace both 3 and 4 because 4 is kind of a function of this Eisenmanian multiplication by mitosis of these various figures. And I would suggest a conservative but critical treatment of Peter is Oscar Cullmann, Cullmann, Peter, disciple, apostle, martyr, which is very wide-ranging, pretty conservative, but that shouldn't stop us, even if we're not. It's very interesting. And then there is Arthur Drews, spelled as if it's Drews. What's it called? I think it's The Legend of Simon Peter. And it was, I'm sure you could find it on Amazon or something, Arthur Drews, Drews. And those are kind of the extremes. There's also a Paulist Press paperback called Peter in the New Testament, which is a symposium of views about him. Came out in the early 70s, I think. That's well worth reading also. And there are these different perspectives, which is, of course, what you want there. One last thing, I've mentioned this recently in a similar connection. It might well be, and I think Margaret Morrison says this, basically, that Peter and some of the other big names may represent, Clement would be another one, might actually be early Christian leaders, whether of that name or not. Those names are not, but they've been written back into the story. And the analogy I like here, though I don't think Margie has come up with this yet, is what Madame Blavatsky did with the ascended masters of theosophy. She had all these undying avatars and bodhisattvas who kind of rule the world from behind the scenes, and she claimed to receive revelations from them and so on. And they had these exotic names, Kut Humi, Moria El, a whole mess of other ones. The Summit Lighthouse kind of inherited this, and the Great I Am movement were both offshoots of this, and they have the ascended masters. I think Alice Bailey called them the Great White Lodge. This whole movement is very, very fascinating too. But it turns out these ascended masters that she talked about can be traced down to individuals she knew. They were friends of hers, and she kind of made them into these mythical characters. Well, that could quite easily be what happened with the apostles, though so little is said of hardly any of them that you can't, that might weaken that theory. You might have thought they would be characterized a bit more if they represented real characters. And that fires back on the Peter thing too, because how much of the Petrine business is either literary, like making him a foil, a Mr. Interlocutor character, like a Sherlock Holmes, Ananda, or Jimmy Olsen figure, that the writer uses him to bring up questions that the reader probably has in mind, so as to have the hero explain things to this diegetic, I guess you could say, this intra-narrative character, but really aiming it at the reader. And then the rest of it, like the betrayal of Peter and some of this other stuff, would be anti-Petrine propaganda. As another great one, Arlo Now, N-A-U, Arlo J now, NAU, did this fascinating book called Peter in Matthew. That's filled with fascinating insights too, as to how Matthew embodies a couple of stages of raising and then lowering again Peter's stature as found in the Gospel of Mark. So those are the reading suggestions I've had. I'm sure there are plenty of other ones, but keep up the good work, Jason. Here's Anders in Stockholm. It says, in Genesis 19:14, depending on the translation, Lot's daughters are either married or about to be married. If they were in fact married and Lot's offer to the crowd consists of virgin daughters, could one draw the conclusion that the anger of the crowd stems from a feeling of Lot trying to fool them? Since he was a resident of the town, the mob would probably know beforehand. What does the geek think? Actually, that doesn't really sound viable to me, because the fact that they were known in the town, as you say, would imply it'd be useless to even try such a ploy. And that pushes me toward thinking that the fiancé approach is really what is intended, that it'd be better to translate it that way rather than wives. His sons-in-law are, in other words, his daughter's fiancés. But, who knows? I'm not closing the door here, right? It does call them his sons-in-law, but I think you have to balance that evenly with the claim that they're virgins, and if they aren't, that does raise the problem you mentioned. Yeah, so I never even thought of that before. It's fascinating, Anders. Thanks a bunch. Lachlan says, in Job 26:13, is the crooked serpent the constellation Draco or Draco? I don't know. Or is it the Milky Way? Actually, I think now either of those is possible, but Leviathan, the name of the serpent, tells us what its origin was, as Michael Goulder points out in his fascinating book, The Psalms of the Sons of Korah. Leviathan is the personified river Litani that I think divides Syria from Lebanon, and it's still there on the map today. And it had several tributaries, and this is what gave rise to it as this many-headed serpent. And it's simply the same name, percolating slight variants as it goes through history and into different languages. It's the same seven-headed dragon we meet in the Baal myths as Lotan, and Leviathan is simply the same thing. It's kind of a part of a mythological pattern where, in the Psalms, it also says that God has quieted or defeated or whelmed the sea. Well, that's a personified entity. Baal fought Yam, which is, I think, the same thing, right? The Sea of Reeds is the Yam Suf. So he fights there again, the personified waters of chaos, concretized into a sea serpent. The Hydra that Hercules fought. Well, you know what Hydra means in Greek? Water. So this idea of a sinister sea dragon represents the primordial waters out of which the earth emerged. And the phrase, well, in the Genesis 1 account, the priestly creation account, there's an attempt to begin to demythologize this earlier mythology. And so Tiamat, one of the dragons Marduk fights in the Babylonian version of the creation by combat myth, Tiamat, that's a plural. It becomes Tahom, the deep, the ocean depth, as well as Tohu, formless. The earth became or was without form, Tohu, and void or empty, which is Bohu. Now, Bohu is the singular for behemoth, the land Leviathan, as Michael Moorcock would call them. And so what you have here is the dragons are going back into a kind of an abstraction from which they emerged by the mythologizing process. So it seems to me that though, but of course, like you say, the constellation Draco is a mythologizing of a river dragon. So they could have understood Leviathan, the twisting serpent, to also have been placed in the stars. Though I don't know if there's direct evidence for that connection, but it sure would make sense. It's an interesting speculation, which is sometimes all you can do until speculation grows into a paradigm and you start seeing how it makes new sense of other odd bits. See, John Brockman. So the Midianites were a nation, a league of tribes, an amphictyony, a bunch of people living in a place, and they worshiped Yahweh, and Moses is supposed to have met them and married one of them. Well, one of their daughters, because women don't really count as being part of a population or something, then Moses kills them all. And at some point, Midian oppressed Israel or something. Well, that vagueness is quite appropriate because they do have a big row with the Midianites, though Jethro is the priest of Midian, and he becomes the father-in-law of Moses. So, but I think Midian is supposed to be a tribal league like the Ishmaelites and the Edomites and the Israelites, and so it's not too surprising you could have different relations with different branches of it. Okay, going on with John. Clearly, I don't know my Old Testament all that well, or Near Eastern history. How much of all that stuff is history? How much is mythology? Did the Midianites conquer Israel, explaining how a Canaanite people grafted a foreign god, Yahweh, into their mythology? Is Moses marrying a Midianite daughter and then slaughtering the Midianites a fictional explanation for the pre-Hebrew appropriation of Midianite religion, and then some equally fictional or historical revenge on their erstwhile conquerors? Well, two things there that are baby steps toward an answer. Yahweh appears to have been worshipped by other groups than the ones we call the Israelites. There were Edomite worshippers of Yahweh, as it certainly implies in one of the Psalms. Oh, is it one of the Psalms? I think it is. Or is it the Song of Moses in Exodus 15, that Yahweh comes forth from Mount Seir, which was in Edom, and archaeological remains and inscriptions show that Yahweh was worshipped all over that region, not monotheistically, but one of the gods nonetheless. So it isn't implausible at all that the Kenites, a subgroup of the Midianites, would already have been Yahweh worshipers. We don't really have to posit borrowing. In fact, the whole notion that we've always heard that the Israelites, the Jews, Hebrews, whatever, had borrowed pagan ideas from the Baal cult and all that seems to be a lot of nonsense. It has become clear that the Israelites simply were Canaanite polytheists, and all this notion that, oh, they never should have borrowed all that pagan stuff was just a kind of literary scapegoating foisted on us by much later writers who knew darn well, and knew that everybody else knew, that Israel had always been polytheistic, but now these guys, these scribes and so on, were trying to make it monotheistic. So they retrojected the monotheism back to Moses and figured, well, if he and then the prophets were preaching monotheism, how come everybody's worshiping Baal as well? Well, they must have borrowed it, or they must have been seduced into it by those damn Canaanites, and whom the Israelites destroyed to put a stop to that. Of course, they never destroyed them. There's no evidence of any conquest of Canaan, where there would have to be if it had happened. And they simply were Canaanites. Canaanite became a word meaning heretic, basically, that later on they said, oh, well, those are the Canaanites who worship Baal. Not quite. Let's see here. Oh yeah, what about the wars between them? I still think the most likely interpretation of that is that of Hermann Gunkel, the great father of form criticism, who said all of these stories really are trying to account for the way these groups relate in the writer or the storyteller's own day. He's trying to push it back either to disputes or alliances or whatever between the eponymous ancestors, guys actually named, Edom or Esau or, excuse me, whatever, Israel or Jacob, how they got along. Well, that's the way we get along, and that's why we get along or don't. Or they pushed it back into the time of Moses, and it wasn't just one guy versus another, like Cain versus Abel, but the groups who are fictively posited as the ancestors of our groups today. In fact, that's almost explicit when it says, I think Midianites, no Midianite or Amalekite will ever be able to show up at the temple because of the way they treated us way back when. Well, that's almost self-explanatory. Who knows whether there was ever such a tussle, but there is today, so we have to assume there was back there, and we're just carrying on the tradition. Yeah, so good questions, John. From the typeface, yeah, this is Jason again. And he says, on a recent episode I listened to Out of Order, a fellow geek wrote in regarding the Christian themes of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Philip K. Dick, I think, right? While I'm far from being the most informed amateur Bible scholar on the planet, I'll put my Philip K. Dick bona fides up against pretty much anybody. So I thought I might provide a bit more information on the topic of Dick's religious views, if it please the court, and feel free to trim this down, and so on. You said, what? Wait a minute. Am I missing something here? You said in your response to Laughlin's question that the story sounded like a Gnostic view of the demiurge to you, and I would agree, and I think so would Dick, at least in his later days. Dick famously had a religious experience in the middle of 1974 in which he believed that an alien intelligence directly inserted a divine gnosis into his mind via a pink laser beam that emanated from outer space. His explication of that experience formed the basis of much of his later work, and he also directly referenced Valentinus and Valentinian Neoplatonic metaphysics as a sort of metaphor for the truth in a lot of his writing. Although I think it would be a mistake to think that Dick believed those things literally in the way a 4th century Gnostic might have. I don't recall offhand any direct references to Altizer, but I would be surprised to discover that Dick had not read him. Dick was close friends with Bishop James Pike, a radical theologian from the 60s, who served as the model for Timothy Archer in Dick's last novel. Transmigration of Timothy Archer. I doubt that this would have influenced Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, though, since that book was written in 1967 or 68. Dick began exploring religious themes in his work in the mid-60s, but his work in the 60s doesn't really reflect the mature theology that he developed in the 70s after his Gnostic epiphany. Also, the falseness of Mercerism is shown to be only partial, at least because Mercer later intervenes directly in the events of the novel, saving Deckard's life. The fullest explication of Dick's religious ideas in his novels takes place in the books Radio Free Albemuth, Valis, The Divine Invasion, and The Transmigration of Timothy Archer. If you or your listeners would like to investigate Dick's work further, The recently published exegesis of Philip K. Dick, drawn from his journals, is probably a for obsessive specialists only read, but any of those novels is as much fun to read as just about anything out there, and I recommend them highly. Yeah, I gotta read some Philip K. Dick. From everything I know about him, he sounds fascinating, and seen a couple of the movies, which are probably very loosely based on his work, though pretty fascinating. Anyhow, I just want to say something about this hallucination he had. I think that even though something like this must be categorized as a purely mental event intra your head, and therefore a hallucination, I don't scoff at them, because I don't know where to draw the line between hallucinations, even psychotic hallucinations, and creative breakthroughs. Visions are very powerful no matter where they come from. And I guess my only qualm is if you think they're delivering to you descriptions of external reality. That seems to me to be a dangerous way to go. But I think such visions are important, and people that have them are lucky to do so. So I'll have to catch up on my Philip K. Dick reading. Thank you, Jason. Let's see. In fact, somebody was suggesting to me that I might try to write the, what was it, the Manichaean Gospel of John that Dick mentioned somewhere. I got to look into it, though. Dale from Gordon Conwell. I was thinking again about the birth narrative in Luke versus Matthew. We often say, and they would have you believe, that there is a difference of 10 to 12 years between the two. Luke set in 6 AD, while Matthew is set between 6 and 4 BC. But I was thinking about the age that Luke has Jesus begin his ministry. He says that John's baptism begins in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, or 29 AD in Luke 3:1. If Jesus was born in 6 AD, that would make him only 23. But Luke specifically says he was about 30 years old, Luke 3:23. Of course, this is impossible. There's no way that Luke intends us to think that Jesus was born in 6 AD. He says that the birth of John and Jesus take place in the days of Herod, king of Judea, Luke 1:5. That means that Matthew and Luke agree on the timing of Jesus' birth. Luke is just wrong in placing the census and reign of Quirinius at the time of his birth, Luke 2:1. Does that sound right? Yes, indeed, Dale, and surely that is the case. It's just a mix-up, the same way you have one in Acts 4, I think, where Gamaliel lists these previous false messiahs, Judas of Galilee, which is, of course, is where Luke gets the 6 AD thing. Judas led the revolt against Quirinius because of the first-time imposition of Roman taxes on the Jews. And then he lists Theudas, the magician, and now this Jesus guy, but in fact, Theudas the magician was later than Jesus. And so it's just a kind of a typical goof for Luke, and not to be taken all that historically, whether or not Luke meant it that way. But then you got to wonder, well, if he did know better, isn't he just writing a story and cutting some corners? John Dominic Crossan thinks that the Gospels are not intended to be read as history, though they contain materials enabling us to reconstruct the Jesus of history. Right now, I'm rereading Thomas L. Thompson's fascinating book, The Messiah Myth, where he says that he just barking up the wrong cross to look for a historical Jesus behind the Gospels. And like me, he says that the Jesus Seminar was wildly optimistic in thinking you could get like 18% of the facts out of the Gospels. And he said generally European scholars are much more skeptical, and that's certainly correct. Let's see. Uh, who is this one from? R.A., I think. I'm not sure who that is, but it doesn't matter. The text speaks for itself. I first discovered the possibility that Jesus may have been complete fiction around 1990. Since then, I have searched for hard evidence that he existed, and like you, the more I looked, the less I found. In that search, I recently ran across something I've never heard anyone else mention, but which seemed like a piece of the puzzle, and I'd like your thoughts. I was reading Adversus Marcionum against Marcion by Tertullian. And let me just see here. And I ran across the point that Marcion rejected all four Gospels and held only a single gospel to be true, the one Paul dictated to Luke and known as the Gospel of the Lord. It is described as a shortened and truncated version of Luke that Tertullian dismisses as an obviously later rendition. It strikes me that everything I've ever read about the Synoptic Gospels always says that behind them was this never found shorter version called the Q Gospel. This gospel of the Lord be it, and could this prove that Jesus was complete fiction, since Paul, the Joseph Smith of the first century, created the foundation of the Gospels? This is dependent upon a bunch of prior decisions you have to make. I'll just say right off the bat, though, that I follow Joseph R. Hoffman and I'm sorry, that's R. Joseph Hoffman and Joe Tyson and others who in turn follow John Knox's book Marcion in the New Testament from 1942, and even some of the Tübingen critics of the 19th century, and saying what Tertullian says is exactly the opposite of the truth. That he didn't come up with an abridged gospel or a fake one after the four gospels, but that his gospel was, which he seemed to attribute to Paul, which, however, needn't mean that he thought Paul actually wrote it, but probably didn't mean that Luke dictated it from Paul, because that what Tertullian is doing is sort of reading his belief in this tradition of Lucan authorship into what Marcion says about the gospel that he used. I don't think Marcion would have mentioned Luke at all, and I think it's just he's adding what he presupposes into the argument against Marcion. And it seems to me that that the Marcionite gospel was the so-called Ur Lucas, this early version of Luke. You might call it a proto-Luke, except that phrase is used for a different scholarly reconstruction by B.F. Streeter and Vincent Taylor and others. That's an interesting theory also. But at any rate, Luke was based on this. It was expanded and Catholicized. That seems far more likely to me. But Richard Arthur has argued that the Gospel of Mark was the Marcionite gospel, and there are pretty good reasons for thinking so. Paul Louis Couchot had a more complicated theory that I have read a couple of times but cannot remember it well enough without digging it out again and rereading it. An essay called "Was Marcion's Gospel One of the Synoptics?" And he goes into this and how he thought it fit in. I would take a look at that if you can find it. I suspect you could online. Was Marcion's Gospel One of the Synoptics? By Couchot, Couchoud. He was a mythicist, by the way. I don't think it would fit being Q, though, because it depends on whether the tradition is right in saying that the Marcionite gospel was some version of Luke. because Q isn't enough like Luke, it seems to me. People only speak about Q at all because they're trying to solve the problem of why Matthew and Luke have nearly verbatim agreement on a whole lot of material that they don't agree on because they got it from Mark, right? They overlap Mark extensively, but the best guess, I think, is that they overlap there because they both independently used Mark, and then that kind of sets the pattern for all this other stuff they have in common with the same sort of minor differences that they had on Mark, but the stuff is not in Mark, so they would have gotten it from someplace else. And in that case, I don't think and Q wouldn't have been a narrative gospel, whereas we get the impression from like Tertullian elsewhere that what he understood to be the Marcionite gospel was a cut version, or I would just say a shorter version of Luke. But I'd take a look at those guys. Joseph R. Tyson. What is the name of that book? I can't keep them all straight. But just look his name up, Tyson, on Amazon, and I don't know that you can even get a hold of Knox's Marcion in the New Testament. Maybe somebody's reprinted it. And R. Joseph Hoffman has just a terrific book on Marcion. And any of those are really great stuff. Oh, yeah, I should also mention that if I've got this right, Stephen Huller has a theory that the original gospel from which all four were derived was something that would have looked like the diatessaron, the thing that's supposed to be a harmony of the gospels, patching all of them into one narrative. But Huller thinks it was just the reverse. Rather than patching the four together, that the four were each abstracted from the one basic one. And that, I think, I think maybe he attributes that to Marcion, but I would look up his blog. I forget what it's called, but again, Stephan, Stephan, Huller, Huller. He does have a blog. I don't know the name of it or the address right offhand, but I bet you could find that, and that it'd be better to read his own theories than my butchered, confused account of them. Alexander, the PhD student from Ohio. I find the arguments for the identity of Paul as Simon Magus to be extremely compelling. However, might the scenario where Paul brings a tribute to Peter also fit with Marcion? You've mentioned that Marcion also approached the early Catholic Church with financial tribute as part of his bid to become a bishop, only to be rebuked by Polycarp. This sounds an awful lot like another parallel to the story where Paul approaches Peter with money in a bid for apostolic recognition, and the "may your money follow you into perdition" bit. This sounds a little far-fetched, but it is possible that elements of both Simon Magus and Paul have been spun out of a single event, namely Marcion's attempt to win recognition with the early church, and that Simon Magus is the bad version and Paul is the comparatively good version. Or are there reasons for thinking that Marcion is too late to have influenced the Paul-Simon Magus stories? Funny fact, little did I know, but about 2 years ago, I had the pleasure of being in a Sanskrit class with the great Frank Zindler, who I found to be incredibly sweet and friendly. I didn't realize until the next semester who he was. Frank Zindler is an amazing character. He's like Albert Schweitzer. He's got the brains of a whole bunch of people stuffed into his skull. He's a polymath. He's a Renaissance man. He's talented in so many areas and in different kinds of areas. And he is the sweetest person you could ever meet. Also hilariously funny. He is really just great. And as for the rest of it, I think you're exactly right on all of that. As I explain in my turgid tome, The Amazing Colossal Apostle, The Search for the Historical Paul, I do think that Simon Magus was the historical Paul, and that, however, Marcion was the first to start writing Pauline epistles, namely Galatians chapters 3 through 6 and a somewhat shorter version of Ephesians. So I think you're right down the line, and that the Galatians thing about, the bringing the tribute to Jerusalem and so forth is based on Marcion's ill-fated trip to Rome for recognition. So bravo. In fact, I'd grant you that PhD right now if I could. Let's see. From Beloved Son of Rock. We can kind of guess that has something to do with Peterson. That's pretty good. Let's see. He's in Minneapolis. In Genesis 15, Yahweh promises Abram that he will have an heir who will be of his own flesh, eh? No, I'm sorry, that's Canada. Don't you know? And flesh and blood, and compares the number of his future descendants to the number of stars in the night sky. Then in a frightening vision, Yahweh said to Abram, know this for certain, that your descendants will be exiles in a land not their own, where they will be slaves and oppressed for 400 years. But I will pass judgment also on the nation that enslaves them, and after that they will leave with many possessions. For your part, you shall go down to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a ripe old age. In the fourth generation they will come back here, for the wickedness of the Amorites is not yet ended. Genesis 15:13 through 16, Jerusalem Bible. And now this passage from the J source. And am I reading this correctly to say that Yahweh is going to allow Abram's descendants to be enslaved so he can punish the nation that enslaves them, and then punish the Amorites after they had stewed long enough in their wickedness? In other words, Yahweh wants to punish Egypt and the Amorites, but to do this, he first needs to have Abram's descendants suffer. Let me take a second look at that. Your descendants. I don't, what does this say about the source's concept of Yahweh? Are there any publications on the theologies of each of the different sources and the editor of the Torah? Well, I would think there are a bunch of books on the Pentateuch that talk about this, but probably the best one is still Julius Wellhausen's great book, Prolegomena to the History of Israel, or in the paperback, Prolegomena to the History of Ancient Israel, where he sets out the uniqueness of each source. And though I kind of think Gunkel does too in his book, The Legends of Genesis, and Shorter Compass, but I bet if you looked up Old Testament source criticism or the documentary hypothesis, you'd find good summaries of them. I have kind of a thumbnail sketch of that stuff in Moses and Minimalism, which has now just appeared from Intellectual Press. I don't see the connection in that passage that says he's using them as a tool to get at Egypt and the Amorites, which is the Deuteronomic version of the Canaanites. It just seems to me he's saying, you're okay, you're in the clear, but your descendants will spend 400 years enslaved. But don't worry, I'll really kick the butt of the people that enslaves them, and then of the Amorites after them. I get is he just telling them what's going to happen, or is he causing it to happen? You'd think the latter, though that's not absolutely clear. But he doesn't say that he's enslaving them for 400 years in order to punish the Egyptians. If they're already such stinkers, why doesn't he just do it right now? And it doesn't say that it's an instrumental sort of a thing. And why is it even in there? Well, this is like the passion predictions of the Gospels, where it's really aimed at the reader. It's a kind of a coming up next week kind of a thing to let the reader know what's going to happen. And it's if it's one of the early sources, whatever you mean by early these days, it would be the J source, because we've not yet had the changeover to Yahweh from the E source or the priestly source yet. So it would have to be, but it might be a Deuteronomic interpolation or redaction, let's say, and it's tough to say really, but I don't think it necessarily shows God as the puppet master here. It might, but that doesn't seem clear enough to me in it. Okay, let's see. How about Albert? Let me see if I can read this. Akesson in Gothenburg, Sweden. Got a couple of Swedes here this time. I'm having a difficult debate about the significant use of form criticism in historical research. My opponent thinks that form criticism is obsolete, and there are more modern alternatives in use nowadays. He won't answer what kinds of methodology it's about. He persists on the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin as proof for the death of the Holy Savior. But I cannot find any serious historians in favor of this issue. Are there any? Why? Let me pause there. The Shroud thing is just nonsense. It's on the level of phrenology and phlogiston and creationism. The way these guys have to wriggle around to evade the clear results of a carbon-14 test years ago is just pathetic, and it's been refuted and re-refuted by Joe Nickel and from the Psychop group and various other people. It's just ridiculous. It's unworthy of any serious concern, and no real scholar gives it concern. It's just a part of Roman Catholic apologetics. And I'm not just appealing to authority here. I just don't want to go through all the arguments against it. But I will just say that, what's his name? I haven't thought about this in a long time. But Joseph Macron, who is the world authority on paint and pigmentation, says that the red, so-called blood on the shroud shows paint elements. It's pigment. It's not blood, and it wouldn't still be red if it were blood. And there's all sorts of problems, but the carbon-14 test solved it. Now, what they started to say in defense of the shroud is that, well, they must have taken samples from the patches put on the shroud after it got singed and slightly burned, which of course it did, and there are patches, but it's obvious to the naked eye, even in a photograph, what are the patches and what are not. And they didn't take it from the patches. It's just ridiculous. So that's pathetic. As to form criticism, I noticed that some apologists like to say that form and redaction criticism are passé. Nobody takes them seriously anymore. Even while they embrace the orality theories of Milman Parry and Albert Lord, who were trying to show that the ancient Greek epics could have been the work of a single bard, because you can see even today in the Balkans there are people that publicly perform local epics and ballads of great length. But and so they apologists love to point that out, saying that, oh, well, there you go, you could have kept the whole Gospel of Mark in your head and repeated it accurately. But this is just cynical or ignorant appropriation of scholarship that undermines the very thing the apologists try to support. Because the way these bards are able to do this is by just having a kind of skeletal outline of the thing with certain code words in it to remind them of how it's generally supposed to go. But each recital is so different. It counts as a new original. That's what Parry and Lord said. There's no way to use this to defend the accurate transmission of long bodies of material. So there's that contradiction. You might not like form criticism, but you might like this. Well, look, if this is the case, it's worse than what the form critics said in terms of accurate transmission. But even worse, they often are just quoting scholars who were sort of post-form criticism and have gone on to the belief that there's no real oral tradition underlying this at all, that Mark just wrote the thing up out of his own head or possibly from the Septuagint, rewriting the stories, which are already sort of little nuggets one after the other, and that's why they're short little units or pericopi. But the people that say it's passé have gone on to even more radical views of the Gospels and so on, not less. And so I'm afraid he just doesn't know what he's talking about. Let's see. Here's what the rest of Albert's comment. Obviously, he's into your show as well. He says he listens to your podcast every day. His own words follow, translated from Swedish. He's funny, that's all, but not respected among the great names. That's quite likely true. After all, I am a mythicist. Form criticism is completely obsolete. Modern scholars use newer models and criticize form criticism heavily by its own premises. Well, I've just explained what's wrong with that. If, however, it's authentic, the Shroud of Turin, which is likely to be used on the resurrection and statement of the Gospels regarding the death of Jesus. Get out of here. I'm sorry to be so nasty, but that is just so wrong in every way. But hope he continues listening to the Geek, though. I'm sure appreciate that he does. Lachlan says, what's the deal with the common cultural concept that humans can become angels? I'd like to know. On an earlier podcast, you seemed to quote Matthew 8:10, saying that children are the future angels of heaven, but it seems to better support the guardian angel idea, although I'm not sure how good of a job one's guardian angel can do if it's always looking upon the face of God the Father and not looking after its assigned human child. I get the impression, that that's where they get their instructions, just like in the beginning of It's a Wonderful Life. Hey, Clarence, get over here. I got a job for you down there. I understand that it's a source for drama. Human past makes Highway to Heaven more interesting. You mean that the angel used to be little Joe Cartwright? But the idea of human apotheosis is so non-biblical that I'm surprised there isn't a general call for blasphemy. Is there an exegesis that makes this biblical? Is this an enduring cultural tradition like the belief in ghosts or the checking of one's horoscope, or are we looking at a purely modern invention? Now, I bank on the hilarious story in Acts 12, think it is, where Peter is on death row and his pious disciples are down the street at John Mark's mother's house praying for his deliverance. And apparently God hears that prayer and sends an angel to free Peter from the jail cell. And Pete first thinks it's a dream. But then once he gets out of the compound and the angel disappears and he is standing there in the cold of the night on that street, he says, well, geez, I guess it really happened. So he makes a beeline for John Mark's mom's house and knocks on the door where, keep in mind, the pious Christians are praying for his release. And their maid, Rhoda, hears this and goes to the door, I guess looks through the hole or pushes the curtain aside or opens it a crack or something and sees Peter, and she is so stunned she forgets to open the door, runs into where they're praying and said, oh my God, it's Peter at the door. And they say, hey, crazy, it must be his angel. That's so great, because the I'm sure intentional humor is there, that these praying Christians have so little faith it doesn't even go through their mind that their prayer might have been answered, right? But at any rate, what does he mean when he says it must be his angel? Well, I think it has to mean it's too late. He's dead already, and his angel has come to bid us goodbye. Well, what do you know? In Zoroastrianism, they did have the idea that they had combined the notion of a kind of Valkyrie maiden who collected the souls of the dead and a guardian angel. And this transmogrified on into Syrian and Jewish Christianity and Valentinian Gnosticism, where they believe that you have several bodies, concentric, made of different material. And like in the ascension of Isaiah, where Jesus goes down to earth, as he passes each of the planetary spheres, he puts on a body appropriate to that sphere, so the archons will not detect him passing. And then when he gets down to the sublunar sphere of earth, he puts on a garment of flesh. Then when he ascends, he sloughs off each one in turn. Well, that was kind of what they believed about everybody. And a lot of ancient people believed that you have different bodies. This is a common view today among New Age metaphysical people. It's not that far from Aristotle, who speaks of the appetitive soul and this kind of soul and all that. And the belief in ghosts, which you mentioned, is partly understood this way by a lot of people, that time comes for you to die, and perhaps your higher self goes to the afterlife or whatever, but your physical, your appetitive soul, I mean, the physical body is dead and rots, but the appetitive soul of Aristotle lingers because it misses all the pizza and stuff like that. It wants to be back on Earth, but it's too late, but it just keeps hanging around. That's what a ghost is, according to a lot of people. So these Gnostics and Syrian and Jewish Christians, holding on to this ancient Zoroastrian idea, believe that your highest body, the true spirit, is the resurrected Christ. And it is your guardian angel. And they used to have a sacramental visionary experience called the bridal chamber, where you had, like the bride of Christ thing in Corinthians and Revelation, that you had this union, this honeymoon, this union with your highest self, the resurrected Christ. You're part of the body of Christ, right? All that stuff in Ephesians. So that it seems to me that the most natural interpretation of the Acts thing is to say that your guardian angel is your higher self, which then it implies is the risen Christ. So you have to put some pieces together there, but I think they fit pretty darn well. By the way, Origen in the 2nd century believed that all human beings used to be angels. We had an incorporeal existence before the material world, and that we all sinned. I guess maybe he was thinking of the fall of the angel stories. I once had a student, an older woman, I love older students, came up to me in a world religions class. I forget what we've been talking about, but she says, I know this may sound crazy, but I have always believed that we are the fallen angels. And I said, well, congratulations, sister. You just agreed with Origen of Alexandria, and that's I guess that's compatible, but in a sense it's another form of it. You are an angel, and so if there is this higher self keeping an eye on you, well, in a way that's almost a parable for your conscience, right? So I think it is really a biblical idea, though you do have some dots to connect, but there are enough of them that I think you can use straight lines to do it. Well, that's going to be it for today's geekery, but I'll be back with you again soon, and if you can help out the geek and his struggling family, and boy, am I not kidding, I'd sure appreciate your donations. If not, don't worry about it, and I'll see you here again next time on The Bible Geek.